Yeah.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the War Room. This is for this weekend's co-main event between Cory Sandhagen and the legend that is Frankie Edgar. Okay, first of all, UFC stats. So 13-2 for Cory Sandhagen. Average fight time is almost 8 minutes. Frankie Edgar, 23-8, and his average fight time is 17 minutes and 4 seconds. I mean, this is a guy that's defended belts over 5 rounds against some of the best in the world. That's the first thing we need to say about Frankie Edgar. And the fact that his stats are based on a career against the likes of Gray Maynard, BJ Penn, and all of the other greats that he's faced. He's still got incredibly impressive stats, even though he's been fighting the best crop of fighters in the last 10 years. Sandhagen, on the flip side, he's still chasing after that title shot. He's a very exciting fighter, and he's only got one loss on his record in the UFC, which is Aljamain Sterling, rear naked choke. The wins that he's got, the likes of Rafael Assunção is a massive win, especially over the distance. Assunção is a dangerous fighter from the start to the end of the fight, and sometimes for me, it's more impressive for a young fighter to be able to win a fight over the distance and not get hurt, not get caught, not get stopped against someone like that. So, like the staying power of Cory Sandhagen is something that you can't question, and we saw that in his submission defense against Alcantara as well. He was in all kinds of problems in that first round and was just tough and durable and was not going to quit and found his way into a better position where he was able to ground and pound in the second round. But, there were certain circumstances in that fight where, a lesser fighter would have been submitted, no doubt about it. So toughness and skill level, I'm very, very excited for Cory Sandhagen in his future. He's still young in the game. He's still only got 15 fights, and he's stepping in here against Frankie Edgar, who's got loads of experience. But he is coming off wins over the likes of Marlon Moraes and Assunção, who have both got more fights than him anyway. So I don't think experience is going to play into his mind too much. And I think much like the main event, you kind of know what you're getting with Frankie Edgar. You know what he's great at. You know where his flaws are. We've seen him pay for those flaws a couple of times. And I feel like Cory Sandhagen, with the skill set that he's got and the diversity of the skill set that he's got, the dynamic nature of his striking makes him incredibly difficult for someone like Frankie Edgar to work with. Like, Frankie's from a previous generation where his footwork is from boxing, his wrestling's from wrestling, his jiu-jitsu's from jiu-jitsu, and everything's kind of stitched together, like after the fact. He was a great wrestler. He added boxing to his game. You can see that he's crafted this game out of the separate pieces, whereas you watch Cory Sandhagen and you just feel like he's learned everything at the same time. Like, there's no glue that holds this together because it's all one thing for Cory Sandhagen. And I think that's where, for me, Frankie has always looked like a more modern fighter because he's got less seams in his game. But as time has moved on, those seams in his game that were at one point relatively seamless because he was compared to other guys that were very much one-sided, now those seams are starting to show themselves a bit more against these younger fighters that just flow from kicking to grappling to wherever the fight goes, and through stances as well. So Frankie Edgar, for me, has always had a vulnerability in his footwork, which he has actually corrected. I actually saw he has made the adjustment in his last couple of fights, but he had a bad habit of crossing his feet. And that's an old boxing footwork that you can get away with in boxing because no one's going to crack you in the leg. In MMA, he paid for it against Aldo because Aldo was recognizing that he was crossing his feet, so therefore he's got no balance and his center line was off and was just taking his lead leg away. And because Frankie's so focused on footwork and movement being a big part of his game, like when you start to take away that lead leg, it becomes problematic. So he's had to kind of re-educate his own footwork in recent years, so he's not got that vulnerability. But there are still ways that can be exploited with someone like Cory Sandhagen, who moves through ranges so well. Like, Frankie's stopped crossing his feet, but we don't see him switching through stances quite as much as we do some of the younger fighters. If you ask me what stance Cory Sandhagen is, I'll ask you what time of day it is because it switches on a minute by minute basis in the fights. And he's a very tall individual anyway. He's a very long range fighter as it is. He's always going to catch you at the end of something, especially in a smaller octagon, because he's going to travel through distance much quicker. Like, what would take Frankie 2 or 3 steps in an orthodox stance will take Cory Sandhagen one big step from southpaw to orthodox. If you're chasing someone down, obviously there's a benefit because you're covering more distance quicker. If you're getting away from someone, there's obviously a benefit because they're having to take more steps in one stance than you would if you're switching through in 2. And then, with the dynamic nature of his striking style and the fact that he's constantly switching stances, it gets more and more difficult to predict what's coming next. Like, if I know he's good at head kicks and he's always in an orthodox stance, it's much easier to predict where those angles are coming from. If he's in an orthodox stance and he steps through to southpaw and throws a head kick, I'm processing 2 things at the same time. I'm processing the fact that he switched his stance and the fact that this kick's coming now from a different angle. But you watch Sandhagen's fights and he'll step forward again with something else that isn't then a further unpredictability that you've got to assess in those moments. And this is why he's catching people on the ends of his shots. I mean, that spinning kick against Marlon Moraes is a great example of that. Like, there was no way that Marlon Moraes could have predicted that. He reacted to a different technique that was on its way and got caught with the head kick. So there's a danger to Cory Sandhagen's game for Frankie Edgar because Frankie's much better at guys with a more linear skill set. Oftentimes when I'm researching these fights and I'll be doing a war room for the main and co-main, I'll see a similarity in them, and I think there's a big one here. But what's interesting is that the older, more experienced fighter in Overeem in the main event is more like Cory Sandhagen in the way that he fights because he switches through stances and he's unpredictable and he doesn't have the characteristics of a standard disciplined striker. That's a real value in mixed martial arts in the current day. A person that stands in one stance is, in my opinion, now only got half a game, and you're always going to get left behind. So we're going to have to see Frankie force this fight into ways where he can keep control of it so he's not chasing Sandhagen down or trying to get away from him at the same time and predict what's coming on the ends of those stance switches. For me, the best version of Frankie Edgar, especially in this fight, especially against a taller fighter, is to use that wrestling pedigree that he's got. One of my favorite clips ever and one of my favorite takedowns ever is Frankie Edgar against Cub Swanson. And every time I'm talking about Frankie Edgar, I talk about this takedown. But in the moment when it happened, it was an example of Frankie Edgar blurring the lines between striking and grappling. And I think that is where, if Frankie can gravitate towards his grappling and force Sandhagen to work to defend, then he can keep hitting him in the process and not worry too much about stuff coming back because there's not the space between them. Frankie's also very good at staying in people's guard and working, not getting stood up when he's in people's guard. So, the method that he uses is he kind of stacks people onto their shoulders. Like, if I'm sitting in someone's guard and I'm sitting on my heels with my knees bent, like, they're not taking any weight, so they can push me away or pull me forward with their guard. If I'm standing up and stacking over them, they have to push me away. Otherwise, I'm just going to compress them. So what you'll tend to find in Frankie's fights is that he's standing over people and his legs are behind him. So it's almost like he's resting on their guard, which forces them onto their shoulders, which makes their escape routes a lot less easy to find because you've got to get weight off your shoulders before you can move them. And when Frankie's stacking you, they find themselves crunched up with punches coming down and they're trying to hold him off at the same time. It's a very consistent game plan that Frankie's always been really good at. And then if they open their guard, he passes and he scrambles and he constantly forces someone to work. I think Frankie can move quick enough if he utilizes his wrestling and his grappling to keep Sandhagen on the defensive on the ground. They're going to be wild scrambles because Sandhagen's a bit of a wild man when it comes to those scrambles. But I think that's where Frankie can have the most control in the fight. If I'm Sandhagen, I'm playing the long game all day. I'm going to make Frankie work for everything he does. I'm going to punish him for standing heavy on the lead leg. And I'm going to punish him for being a one-stance fighter. The reach and height advantage, let's have a quick look. So Frankie's 2-inch reach disadvantage and a 5-inch height disadvantage. So there is going to be making up to do for Frankie. The benefit to Frankie is that he's always been fighting guys that are either bigger, stronger, taller, more powerful, or whatever. He's always been up against it, but I feel like this is a slightly different kind of fight for him. You look back at Max Holloway, you look back at Chan Sung Jung, Korean Zombie. they're excellent fighters with a diversity in their skill set. Max Holloway steps through in range and he shrinks back by switching his stance as well. High work rate. Korean Zombie. He's very unpredictable, but he will keep a pace on you that forces you to try and think fast. Pedro Munoz, I mean, it was still a split decision win for Frankie, but it was a much more comfortable pace fight, the kind of fight that Frankie wants. Someone that kind of stands there and plods a little bit, and he's there to be picked off and then tries to power punch you to make you pay. Sandhagen's just not that guy. He's not there to be hit. He's not there to be tied up and clinched. He's a very difficult person to pin down, and he's very young in his career. And I do think certainly at this stage in Frankie's career, there's a lot to be said for that. He's fighting these younger guys that have got that upward trajectory and all that momentum behind them. Whereas Frankie's been to the top a few times and he's tried to get there a few more times and it's not quite worked. There's going to come a point where the water's just too deep for Frankie, and this might be it. But, you know, a lot of people thought that about Max Holloway going into the Calvin Kattar fight, and look what he did. So there's definitely an ability for Frankie to come and put it on Cory Sandhagen and kind of big brother him like he did Yair Rodriguez. But Sandhagen's striking and his tenacity and his toughness, you just can't count him out. I'm looking forward to this one. Enjoy the fights. See you next time.